Hi, everyone. My name is Josie Calapenny. I'm the Executive Director of Family Values at Work. And we are here today to bring you the people's response to the president's budget. Family Values at Work is a national organization. We are a network of partners in 27 states with multiple partners that are doing the work to win on leave at the state level and at the federal level. All of our partners are multi-issue partners working on economic justice, racial and gender justice, and equity to create a world where we can all thrive and be and live on our own terms. And so today I brought together some of my friends to talk about the president's budget. I have Mary with me today from California, but currently her feet are down on the ground in DC, and Haram from MLove. I will let them introduce themselves. Incredible, incredible people. So I'm so happy to be having this discussion with you all. Before they introduce themselves, we're going to talk, just a heads up that today we're going to talk a little wonky, but mostly about impact and action. We're going to talk about the president's budget, what's good in there, what's not so good in there, and what happens next. So I'm going to have Mary and Haram introduce themselves, and then I want to give you a little spiel about what the president's budget is and what the budgeting process is, and where we have some room and space and opportunity to impact change. But first, introductions. Mary.
Good morning, Josie. Thank you for having me with you. I'm Mary Ignatius. I'm the Executive Director of Parent Voices California, and we center the wisdom and expertise of families to transform childcare and really all the systems that impact them to be just, fair, and inclusive. So really happy to be with both of you and excited to dig in.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hiram Cortez. I am Executive Director of Many Languages, One Voice, MLove here in DC. And it's great to be here this morning to talk about the budget.
Yes, I cannot wait to get into this discussion. But I think it's important first to start off with just sharing a little bit about like, what is the president's budget? What's the point? Why is it important? So at the federal level, much like some of our organizations, right, and some of the state level, the first quarter of every year, the president proposes a budget to Congress. And to be clear, it is a proposal and not a done deal. And what happens is in that proposal, the president projects what the income the federal government has coming in, and essentially what the federal government has to spend. And so not only does the president have to identify and allocate funds for existing programs, but also gets to identify and allocate funds for new programs, some of which we saw in his budget. Obviously, it takes money to run programs, to establish new benefits, and to run a country. And so the budget becomes the guideline and the outline for what's going to get done. Once the president proposes the budget, Congress takes it and starts the budget process. The different agencies and committees of jurisdiction then start to talk about what they have allocated to them and what they actually need and want. Some of that happens before the president introduces his budget. Obviously, the president and the administration is getting input from folks to put this budget together. But then it goes to Congress, and what Congress does is they move what's called a budget resolution, which lays out the rules and authority to put together the budget. And then there's lots of debates and negotiations that happen. This is an important time for us to be vigilant and to pay attention. So different agencies and different committees in Congress start to debate and negotiate what they want, what was allocated to them, if they want more, if they don't want certain allocations for certain programs. This is when you start to hear about funding being cut to certain programs, funding being increased to certain programs. It's during these heated debates and negotiation. That's an important time to talk to your members of Congress, to pay attention to what committees your members of Congress are, and to let them know, don't cut this, increase this, make sure this makes it in the final budget. So there are negotiations that start to happen. Then on the House side is where the appropriations bill starts. The appropriations bill is actually the formal spending piece of legislation. So the budget and the negotiations actually have to land in a formal bill. That's what's called the appropriations bill. And that's where the real line by line items actually get written out. So the appropriation bill starts in the House and becomes the final spending bill for the next fiscal year. Again, as language comes out around the appropriations bill, we have to pay attention to that. Even though some of the things we're excited about are in the president's budget, between negotiations and when an appropriations bill is introduced, our things could fall out of there, could be reduced, right? Or could become things that we don't actually want. So we have to be vigilant in that process. When the House introduces that legislation, the Senate can propose amendments and changes, and the Senate will also take up the appropriations bill and pass it. Usually it starts in the House, it gets passed, then the Senate will take it up, will amend it or change it, or we'll leave it the same. Very rare that it's left the same. But then the Senate will pass it. And if the bills are a little bit different, there's a reconciliation process where they have to come together with a final process, with a final bill. All of this is really important. The timeline is not a strict timeline, so it can go on for months. This is where in the past we've heard about the government furloughing employees because they hadn't passed a budget. This is also when conversations about the debt ceiling or the debt limit start to really take up a lot of national space. The debt ceiling is how much the government can be in debt, and sometimes our government has to borrow money, usually from itself, in order to cover its spending. So then you'll start to hear people saying, we can't increase the debt limit, which means we have to cut the budget. And you'll hear some people saying, we can afford to borrow a little bit to make sure that the important things are covered. All of this is an important process because it sets the tone for what the priorities are. It also makes very clear value statement. And at the end of the day, it lets us know the amount of money we're actually working with for the programs that we care about. Another important thing to know is that different parties sometimes release their own budget proposals. So the administration is currently Democratic, and we might see a Republican version of a proposed budget. Again, budgets are values documents, so it'll be interesting to see what is and isn't in each proposed budget and what ends. And it's up to us to be vigilant and to raise our voices and to make sure that our priorities are heard during the debate and negotiation period. So we're going to break down some of what's in the budget, but all of this is to educate you all to make sure that you are active and informed folks who are engaging with us to make sure that our priorities are in the final appropriations bill and that this happens in relatively quick order. Our federal government's not known for being quick. But we can really push and put the pressure where it's needed to ensure that we have a budget that demonstrates solutions that are the scale of the problems that our families are dealing with. Okay, so with that rundown, I want to pitch it over to Hiram and to Mary. Guys, what are you all excited about that's in this budget? Talk to me.
Well, I can get it started. I'll pass it to Mary. So Many Languages, One Voice, MLF, we're an organization that works with immigrants here in DC to build power with immigrants, mostly working class, low wage immigrants or children of immigrants who have been facing increased challenges in not just thriving, but just trying to survive, especially since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. So it's been a difficult few years, and they're bearing the brunt on increased housing costs and inflation, low wages, wage theft, a variety of issues, including not having access to certain supports and resources that were made available. because of their legal status or other barriers. So for me, it's great to see the president's proposal paints a vision that responds to a lot of these needs. And so that's great to see. Increased funding for affordable childcare and early childhood education, funding for Title I schools, increased
Mhm.
paid and family and medical leave. So all of that is good. But as you said, Josie, I mean, we'll see what it ends up looking like once. There's already been a lot of opposition to it in the last 24 hours, and so we'll see. How what it actually turns into.
Yeah. Mary, what are you excited about?
I mean, first off, it's really nice to be able to participate in a conversation where there's something really good around childcare. Like that's the sort of place I live in, and most of my 17 years has been really focused on state work because that's where we've been able to make movement.
Yeah.
But the last couple, I've been able to like jump into this federal space because now there's like actually real conversations and
Yes.
real money being attached to expanding access to affordable childcare. So that in and of itself is very exciting. You use the words, like you talked about debt limit and debt ceiling, and I was just thinking, oh gosh, one day we will have a poverty limit and like a poverty ceiling, because
Yes.
like when do we ever measure the strength of our economy by focusing on what we're doing to limit poverty and eliminate it? So one
Yes.
day that will be a live conversation. I also really was just happy to see the like revenue options, like straight up, like we're gonna tax billionaires. I think it's a 25%
Yeah.
tax.
Yeah.
Increase the capital. Okay, so I'm not the
The
tax
capital
expert,
gains
but
tax. Yeah.
yeah, but it's like the budget is a statement of our values, and part of those values is that we actually do have funding available to meet the needs of our families, but we need the political will and willingness to put forth revenue options. So all of that was really good. And in terms of childcare, there is, we all missed out paid family leave, childcare, home-based community services from Build Back Better
Yeah.
being passed. We lost it by those two votes, but it was really good to see the president is still committed to these issues,
Yeah.
and that was reflected in the budget. So I believe it's 400 billion over 10 years, and then specifically for childcare, 9 billion to increase the current way states get funding for childcare. So
Yeah.
9 billion for that, 13 billion for Head Start,
Yeah.
universal preschool. And so, seeing those remain top priorities is really critical. The bad is like we're struggling and we're really living in fear because the American Rescue Plan dollars are, going to expire, and there will be a huge cliff. And our care workers, our child care providers, who are predominantly Black and immigrant women, continue to have poverty wages, and funding the current way we provide reimbursement to those providers is not, it's an old way of dealing with it, and that's why
Yeah.
their wages stay in poverty. So there are still things to fix, but we're off to a better start.
Yeah. Okay. So there's great stuff in there for immigration. There's great stuff in there for childcare. I want to highlight the paid leave pieces. And then I have a question, Mary. You said you've been doing this work for over 17 years, most of it in the States. Hiram, you've been doing state work for a long time too. On the paid leave front, the president's budget includes $325 billion for a national program. This is important to note because most people think they have paid leave through their job. It's not always sufficient. You don't want benefits that are solely job job connected, but also, there's a lot of workers that haven't hit the employer lottery and don't have paid leave. And so to include not just a nod to the need for workers to have paid leave, but to actually have a dollar amount attached to it. And like you said, Mary, to have revenues noted is really important. So the president included $325 billion for a national program. That gets us to where we want, which is a program that provides up to 12 weeks of leave, covers all workers for any reason someone needs to take leave. That's really important. Sometimes our conversation in this country is centered around parental leave, and it's important to know that for many people, especially women of color, the primary need for leave is not parental care. It's health care for themselves or for someone else that they love. So the idea that we can take leave for any reason, that any worker can take leave, and that it provides a significant wage replacement, that's also really important. You can have all the leave you want, but if your wages aren't being replaced at a high enough level, you can't afford to actually take the leave. So $325 billion for a national paid leave benefit is huge. And there's additional stuff in there. There's money to the Department of Labor to enforce the Family and Medical Leave Act, which we know is really important. This is the 30th anniversary of the Family and Medical Leave Act, which has covered a lot of workers who needed to take time off. The Family and Medical Leave Act is not paid, but it does protect your job if you need to be out. And so it's important. And we have employers that retaliate against workers if you take leave, that will demote workers. And so to reinforce a benefit that's already on the books is always an important strategy. And the budget also calls for paid sick and paid safe days, which sounds absurd that this country does not recognize that people shouldn't work when they're sick, but here we are, and that's a clear call in the president's budget. I just want to know, okay, so there aren't some great things. $325 billion is not the full amount that we need. The reality is we need about $450 billion or more. But $325 billion is a much more serious number than we've seen floating around in the past. And state partners, like folks in California, Mary, have proven to us over and over again that once you lay a foundation, you can really build on it and expand on it. So I'm optimistic that even though it's not the number we would want, it's a significant enough number. Hirama, Mary, tell me we're talking about like billions and billions and billions of dollars. Like in my head, okay, it just kind of like sounds like a number that doesn't make a ton of sense to me, that I can't quite apply. But what does it mean for states, right? What does it mean for state programs to be able to have billions of dollars allocated to programs that either need to be established or need to be expanded?
I guess I'll start. I think we as activists have to be really comfortable in talking about billions. Like we can't talk about millions anymore. We have to talk about billions and then probably get to the next one, when we're talking at the national level. I know for California, 9 billion in the federal budget means more or less 10% to California. So around 900 million, which that's not small potatoes. I mean, that's significant, but to get to where we need to be, which is we have 2 million eligible children who qualify for subsidized childcare. Again, I talked about just the poverty wages that our early educators are being paid. Like we cannot subsidize the failure of funding these systems the way they should be on the backs of women of color. And that's what we're doing. When it comes to childcare, we're subsidizing it by charging fees when you start to earn a certain income, you have to pay a fee for your childcare, which we
Mhm.
would never ask somebody like a parent who's going to drop their child off at kindergarten. We would never ask them for a fee.
Yeah.
And so we have to remove these unaffordable fees that families just can't afford. And if we're trying to support them in building their economic security and their financial freedom, we have to get rid of those. And I believe there's some language around affordability in the president's budget, but unclear exactly if it's to eliminate those fees. But that's what we're hoping for, and that's what we're working for in California.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we have so much ground to make up for
Yeah.
because we've seen these programs be treated as like some individual family's responsibility to figure out. And
Yeah.
no, we need societal and public solutions. And so we have to get comfortable talking about billions, because that is what's going to be necessary to get people to a place of dignity.
Yeah.
That's what we're fighting for.
Yeah. Hiram, what does billions of dollars mean at the state level and for our people?
Well, I think that it's moving in. It's a step in the right direction. I think it's still not enough, and there's a lot more that can be done to get us even close to. This is a small fraction of what other countries enjoy, other major
Yes.
economies. So that's putting it into the global context and in that way. But one thing that I'm thinking about is that although this is great and the proposals presents a good vision, and even if this were approved as is, the reality tends to still look very different for the immigrant community members that we work with.
Yeah.
You mentioned retaliation for taking time off. We hear about that all the time. We hear about wage theft and other violations at the workplace, and also the barriers that folks face in exercising their rights.
Yes.
Even with language access. So MLF has worked for a long time on language access in DC. It's been a very long journey. And that was something that was I was glad to see in the budget one mention of it.
Yep.
And working so federal agencies do a better job on that. But we know that it's a very long journey and it moves very slow without having a strong enforcement mechanism for the agencies. So language access presents a barrier. Folks are afraid or get pressure to not exercise their rights because of their legal status. They're afraid to be deported.
Yeah.
We see a lot of funding, also in the billions, for ICE and Border Patrol in this budget. So that's something that has caused a lot of harm and to our families. So that's what comes to mind, that for the reality for immigrant community members, a lot of times is very different.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Well,
so true. Yeah, Mary.
well, I just want to say, and often, when we talk about these things, we're talking about like these programs cost billions of dollars, and that's an expense, right? That's an output. But what we never talk about is the reverse, which is how much these families are putting back into the economy.
Yes.
So when we talk about the billions that immigrants are being taxed,
Yes.
for the work that they do, but then being excluded from the
Yes.
benefits that will protect them is wrong. And when I
Yes.
think about the billions in economic activity that both, families and childcare workers put back into the economy when, they're purchasing materials for classrooms, they're hiring staff and assistants, they're purchasing food and all the things you need to run a childcare business and all of the taxes that come with that. And then these
Yeah.
families who are working and able to walk out the door because they have access to affordable childcare and
Yeah.
all the economic activity that comes with that. So we have to talk about it as a two-way street.
Mary, I love that because you're right. We talk about it as an expense versus an investment. And there's so many returns on investment. And even if we don't talk about it as an investment, like some of this is like run that check back. Like we have actually already put into this, and all you're doing is reimbursing us for the work that we've already done. AARP released their report this week that shows that caregivers in this country, many of whom are working women of color, many of whom, Hiram, are immigrants, provide uncompensated, unpaid care to the value of $600 billion a year. $600 billion a year of unpaid, uncompensated care. So when we're talking about 9 billion for childcare, when we're talking about 13 billion, that's a return on investment. Like we have already invested for generations. We've already invested in this economy, and all you're doing is running that check back, and you're not even doing it in a meaningful enough amount. So yeah, we have to stop talking about it as an expense and really talk about it as an investment in the future, an investment that helps us rebuild this economy, and really reimagine the safety nets in a way that actually work for all of us, Hiram, including immigrants. And I want to talk about, like, this isn't just a praise party for, the president's budget. Hiram, you started to talk about some of this, but there's some things in there that aren't so great that we don't actually have to accept. We can have a both and approach where we can say, we need this, right? Like this is spot on, and actually increase the dollars that you're talking about here. And like, this isn't actually great. So one of those examples that I, have been losing sleep over is the increased funding for the Department of Justice, and the idea that that funding should be allocated towards putting 100,000 new police officers in different communities. And, I saw that and I was just like, what? Make it make sense, as my friends at Make It Work Nevada likes to say, like, make it make sense. The same communities that we're solving for with childcare and paid leave are the same communities that are traumatized by police and police violence. And I don't know that, the police system needs to be completely reformed. And the measures that are in the president's budget are actually regressive and are not about progressive reform of the police system. Putting more police on the ground, I don't know that any of our communities would say that that's the first solution that needs to be funded. And so, like, at Family Values at Work, we are like, yes, we love the paid family and medical leave stuff, and actually, in fact, increase that amount. And like, we completely condemn things like increased money to Department of Justice to police our communities. We know that the police system does not work for the very communities that need to benefit from programs like paid family and medical leave. Hiram, you started to mention some of the things that were in there for immigration that we also need to be really vocal about, saying, get that out of there, actually, if you want this to have the impact that it needs to have. What are some of those things?
Well, there's 25 billion in total for ICE and Border Patrol in the budget, and that's an increase of 800 million from last year. So it's a big jump.
Yeah.
And so we know the deportations are still happening, even though what's sometimes communicated, it might be different. It's still impacting our communities every day, and families being separated, and this has a big impact, especially on our youth, and when they have to stay alone without their parents, if their parents or family members are deported. So that's a big challenge. So that's something that comes to mind, that although, so we see increased funding for processing of asylum cases, of funding for immigration courts to reduce the backlog of cases that are pending in immigration court. We see more funding for refugee resettlement. Like, all of that is great, but it's sort of ameliorating the effects of a broken system. It's not changing a system. So, and then on top of that, more money for enforcement, which we know damages our communities. It's there's pros and cons thing, but also remembering that it's all a broken system. So we're still operating within that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mary, anything stand out to you?
Well, we're not supposed to talk about COVID anymore, right? Like all of the emergency declarations and things have all passed, but like for so many of us on the ground, like COVID hasn't gone away. And the fact
Yes.
is, like, the essential workforce has and was predominantly, that we don't talk about enough, like low income workers of color and immigrant workers. And they were the janitors, the agricultural workers, the grocery store workers, the working in labs and clinics, um and that essential workforce didn't just go away because the pandemic went away. Like, that essential workforce still continues to exist, and we should be propping them up and supporting them, not threatening, you know, excuse me, deportation or
Yeah.
fear. We should be lifting them up and finding ways to get them status in this country, because we depended on them during a critical moment in our country's history. So I don't want us to lose who they were and who
Yeah.
they still are.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding us of that. I mean, it's so important to keep the folks that are most impacted front and center in all of our work. I know we all do that, but sometimes in the busyness of the day, and even as I read the headlines, I remember you were saying just the last 24 hours since the budget's been released, there's so much opposition. And when I read the opposition, people aren't centered in any of that. And the real impact isn't centered in any of that. The good impact and the bad impact, right? Like, we have to be able to talk about it both. And I think it's really important to remember that we have families that are still, care workers and home care workers, domestic workers. We have nurses and childcare workers who are still recovering from the economic impacts to their families and their communities from COVID. And so to just act like none of that has any impact any longer is absurd. And we have to continue to put our people at the forefront of all of the policies that we're advocating for. So, okay. All right. So what's the takeaway? What do we have to be doing in these next couple of weeks when we're tweeting and on social media and TikToking? Is that the verb for TikToking? I don't know. And talking to our members of Congress. And Mary, when we're in DC, Haram, when we're talking to folks that have impact on the budget and on programs, like what's the takeaway? What's the thing we got to be saying and we got to be doing?
Well, I would say that what we'll be doing at MLove is talking with our community members about this, explaining the process like you've done today, Josie, and this highlights the importance of the work that our organizations that are part of this network are doing in voter registration, getting out the vote, educating folks, and about the issues and the importance of who's in Congress and these big decisions that impact everybody's lives, even though it's sort of an obscure process that a lot of folks don't understand. So we have to work more towards voter education around this and fight for the issues that are important to us.
Yeah, Mary, what do you have to say?
I mean, ditto to that. We're working with our members on the same things, and and helping folks see themselves in these processes. It feels so far away. It feels like that's somebody else's like thing to figure out, but our job is to make the federal budget and the state budget something that's accessible, and that they see their role in influencing it, that it's not just enough to learn about it, but it's about where are the pieces and the moments that your power and the collective community's power can influence these processes, and get to the final budget that is inclusive of the things that we want. And so I think that's our role, and to help educate members of Congress and in state legislatures, like just the urgency, like folks can't wait anymore. They've been waiting and they've been getting Band-Aids and one-time funds and things to just like barely survive. And like, it's just wrong to keep putting people in survival mode instead of where dignity and love and thriving and like joy live, like that's all we want for everybody. So
yeah. Well, and at Family Values at Work, we're going to be working with folks like MLove and Parent Voices to support some of the community education that has to happen around budgets. Like, we have to be involved at every step of the democratic process that impacts us, our families, and our communities. And the budget process is one of those, one of those processes and one of those levers of impact that we have to work on. And we're going to continue advocating for the need for paid leave for all and increase, the needs for these public benefits for our communities. We know that the scale of the solution has to be at the scale of the problem. So we have to be talking about billions. We have to be talking about comprehensive. We have to be talking about for all people, but especially for the folks most marginalized. So we're going to keep at it. Just to close us out. All right, Haram, Mary, tell folks where they can find you on the Twitter webs or whatever, and tell me what's bringing you joy going into the weekend. For Family Values at Work, you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram, I think on TikTok, still learning that world. And you can definitely find us online at familyvaluesatwork.org. Not only can we connect you with Hiram and Mary if you're in Maryland, DC, Virginia for Hiram, or if you're in California, we can also connect you to the broader movement of the work that's going on around equity and economic justice and about building the care infrastructure that we need. So Hiram, where can they find you and what's bringing you joy going into the weekend?
Yep. So we're MLOVDC on all the platforms, including our website, mlovdc.org. And I'm looking whenever I'm asked what I'm looking forward to in relation to work, I always say to see in our youth. We work with them Monday and Wednesday. They're in our program, and it's always really fun, and it energizes me to work with our youth and talk about issues like this so that, once they turn 18, they have a lot of information to guide, the way they vote.
I love that. Mary?
We are parentvoices.org on all the things. We are at Parent Voices California. I am ready to get to the airport and fly back to California. And this weekend, I am resuming my soccer mom duties and get to watch my boys crush it on the soccer field. So I'm excited for that.
I love that. Haram and Mary, thanks so much for joining me in this conversation. I'm grateful for partners like you all that make it simple and make it plain, try to make it clear to our communities about what's happening that impacts us all. So I'm super grateful for you all. To my staff at Family Values at Work that makes stuff like this so easy and so possible, Suzette and the digital team, Sammy and the federal team, I'm so grateful for you all and the work you all do every day to keep us connected to our communities and keep us talking about the things that are important. Thanks, everybody. Pay attention to the budget process. We're going to dig deep and keep you all active and engaged. And we're going to have asks of you to call your members of Congress and get this across the finish line in a way that reflects what's important to us. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Josie.